Mark, a struggling law student, marries wealthy widow Eleanor Brooks, unaware he's a pawn in her twisted plan for revenge against his late father. As dark secrets come to light, Mark must decide, escape her grip or confront the truth to seek justice. Will he break free, or will her vendetta destroy them both? Mark Davis, a 23-year-old student, walked through the rain-soaked streets of his small Texas college town. His face reflected the weight of his world. His final year of law school, a part-time job barely keeping him afloat, and debts left behind by his late father. Life felt suffocating. Lost in his thoughts, Mark was startled by the buzz of his phone. "Mark Davis speaking," he answered hesitantly. A composed, authoritative voice responded, "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you regarding your financial situation." Mark froze. "Who are you, and how do you know about my finances?" "I know enough," the woman replied smoothly. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro tonight at 7. It's important." Before Mark could object, the call ended. Confused but intrigued, he made his way to the upscale cafe that evening. Rain poured harder as he arrived, his thin jacket doing little to protect him. Inside, the warm lighting and aroma of fresh coffee provided a sharp contrast to the storm outside. At a corner table sat Eleanor Brooks, a striking woman with silver hair, styled impeccably. She exuded wealth and confidence in a tailored suit. "Mark," she greeted, motioning for him to sit. Her calm yet commanding tone left no room for hesitation. Mark cautiously took the seat opposite her. "Mrs. Brooks, what is this about?" "Straight to the point. I like that," she said, sipping her tea. "Mark, I know about your debts, your father's debts. I know you're struggling to keep afloat. I'm here to offer a solution." Mark's brow furrowed. "What kind of solution?" Setting her cup down, she leaned forward slightly. "Marry me." The words hit him like a thunderclap. Mark blinked, convinced he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said steadily. "This isn't about romance. It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, ensure your financial security, and in return, you'll be my husband." Mark let out a disbelieving laugh. "You're serious? Why me? You don't even know me." "Exactly," Eleanor replied coolly. "You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Mark. I need a companion, someone to share my name and estate. Nothing more. Think of it as a contract." Mark shook his head, his mind racing. "This is insane. What's in it for you?" Her expression softened for the first time. "I've spent my life alone, Mark. I have no children, no family left. I want companionship, even if it's just for appearances. And I want control of my legacy. A husband solidifies that." Mark abruptly stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't. I need time to think." "Of course," she replied calmly. "But don't take too long. The offer won't last forever." Mark walked home in a daze, the rain soaking through his clothes. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his mother, her pale face etched with worry. The cost of her treatments had drained them both, and his younger sister's tuition loomed ominously. After explaining Eleanor's proposition, his mother sighed deeply. "Mark, I know it sounds unthinkable, but if she's willing to help, maybe it's worth considering." Mark stared at his hands, torn between pride and desperation. "You're asking me to marry a woman I don't love just to solve our problems?" "I'm asking you to save yourself," she said, her voice trembling. "To save us." The next morning, Mark returned to Brooks Bistro. Eleanor was already there, calm and composed as before. Without looking up from her tablet, she asked, "You've decided?" Mark took a deep breath, preparing to answer. "I'll do it," Mark finally said, his voice steady yet uncertain. Eleanor smiled faintly, setting her tablet aside. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." A week later, Mark stood in a quiet courthouse, wearing a suit Eleanor had provided. The ceremony was understated, witnessed only by Eleanor's lawyer and a notary. As they exchanged vows, a lingering unease settled in Mark's chest. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Eleanor turned to him with a smile that felt hollow. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." As they exited the courthouse, a light drizzle coated the streets. Mark caught his reflection in a puddle and wondered if he had just saved his family or sold his soul. The gates to Eleanor Brooks's estate groaned open as the cab rolled up the long, winding driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, a sprawling structure with towering columns and a pristine stone facade. It exuded wealth, yet its dark windows felt lifeless. Mark stepped out of the car, his suitcase in hand. The grandeur of the estate felt more like a museum than a home, a place he didn't belong. Eleanor greeted him in the foyer, her demeanor polished and detached. "Welcome, Mr. Davis," she said, her formal tone sending a chill through him. "I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction. Dinner is at 7. Mark nodded silently, following a housekeeper who led him to his room. The space was opulent, an enormous bed, antique furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured gardens. Despite its luxury, the room felt cold, untouched by human warmth. That evening, Mark sat stiffly at the far end of a long dining table, Eleanor seated opposite him. She was dressed impeccably in a silk blouse and pearls, radiating control. The food, prepared by an unseen chef, was lavish and meticulously presented. "I trust you're settling in," Eleanor said, cutting into her filet mignon with precision. "It's different," Mark replied cautiously. "This place is so huge, it feels like I'll get lost." Eleanor smirked faintly. "You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, you're here." Mark bristled at her bluntness. "You didn't tell me much about your late husband." Eleanor's knife paused mid-cut. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin before responding, her tone cool. "He was a businessman, like your father. Their paths crossed a few times." Her voice darkened. "But as you might imagine, not all encounters end well." Mark's pulse quickened. "What do you mean by that?" Her sharp eyes met his. "Let's just say unfinished business has a way of lingering." She sipped her wine and added cryptically, "But that's in the past. You'll understand soon enough why I chose you." Eleanor's words left Mark unsettled. After dinner, he wandered through the vast, quiet halls of the estate. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint creak of the floorboards. He passed several locked doors, their gleaming brass handles catching the dim light. Each door seemed to guard a secret he wasn't meant to uncover. Over the following days, Mark grew more uneasy. The staff avoided eye contact, whispering in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't listening. He caught fragments of conversations that made his stomach churn. Why him? Does he even know? She never does anything without a reason. He'll figure it out eventually. They always do. One evening, while pacing the library, Mark's attention fell on Eleanor's desk. Papers were strewn across its surface, and among them lay a small, ornate key. Its intricate design glinted under the lamp's light. Mark glanced around the empty room, his heart pounding. Reaching for the key, he felt its surprising weight, its cool metal against his palm. Could this be for one of the locked doors? He slipped the key into his pocket, his mind racing. Shadows danced on the walls as he stepped back into the hallway, his breath quick and shallow. That night, lying in the extravagant yet suffocating bed, Mark turned the key over in his hands. Questions swirled in his mind, but one loomed above all. What was Eleanor hiding, and why had she really chosen him? The mansion was cloaked in silence as Mark crept down the dimly lit hallway, the weight of the key in his pocket growing heavier with each step. Its cool surface pressed against his thigh, a constant reminder of the mystery he was about to uncover. His pulse quickened as he reached the door he had noticed earlier, the ornate handle catching the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Glancing over his shoulder to ensure he wasn't being watched, Mark slid the key into the lock. The soft click echoed through the stillness, sending a shiver down his spine. Slowly, he pushed the door open, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. The air was heavy with dust, and the faded wallpaper told stories of a bygone era. Photographs in tarnished silver frames lined a table, capturing moments of joy and connection. One image showed Eleanor as a young woman, standing beside a man Mark assumed was her late husband. Another photograph featured an unfamiliar couple, their faces smiling, but now lost to history. But what caught Mark's attention wasn't the photos. It was the stack of papers scattered across the desk. He sifted through them, his eyes widening with every page. Legal documents detailed failed business ventures involving Eleanor's husband and Mark's father. One letter, written in sharp, angry handwriting, accused his father of betrayal. "You destroyed everything. My family was left with nothing because of your lies." Mark's breath hitched as he reached the final page. A marriage license? His name and Eleanor's were printed clearly, but what shocked him most was the date. It had been filed weeks before the wedding, long before he'd even agreed to marry her. On the desk lay an old leather-bound diary. Mark hesitated, then opened it. The entries were Eleanor's, revealing a meticulously calculated plan. Each page was filled with thoughts of vengeance and manipulation. "I will take everything from him, just as his father did to me. He will be my pawn." Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The diary confirmed his deepest fears. This wasn't a marriage, it was a trap. The creak of the door behind him made his blood run cold. "Enjoying yourself?" Eleanor's voice was icy, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Mark spun around, guilt and fear written across his face. "Eleanor, You thought you'd find answers here?" she interrupted, stepping into the room. Her silhouette was sharp against the dim light from the hallway. "Curiosity killed the cat, Mark. What do you think you're doing?" His voice was firm, though his fear was evident. "Why did you really marry me? Is this about my father? Is this some kind of revenge?" Eleanor's eyes hardened, her usually composed demeanor cracking. "It's not your place to ask questions, Mark. Just do as you're told, and you'll leave this marriage better off than you started. Isn't that enough for you?" Mark's fists clenched as anger replaced his fear. "Enough? You've lied to me, manipulated me. This isn't a marriage, it's a trap." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "A trap, is it? Maybe you should have thought twice before signing those papers." She stepped closer, her tone dripping with venom. "You think you're clever, Mark, but you're just like your father, blind to the damage you cause until it's too late." Mark glared at her, the weight of his father's legacy crashing down on him once more. "If you hated him so much, why take it out on me? I had nothing to do with what he did to your family." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them stretching unbearably. Finally, she turned on her heel. "You're in over your head, Mark. Stay out of matters that don't concern you." Her footsteps faded down the hall, leaving Mark alone in the suffocating stillness of the room. Later that night, Mark lay wide awake in bed, his mind racing. Eleanor's words haunted him, but so did the documents and diary. Why had she gone to such lengths to entangle him in her schemes? Was it really just about revenge? His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of Eleanor's voice. He slipped out of bed and crept toward her study, pressing his ear against the door. "Make sure the transfer is complete," Eleanor said, her tone sharp and commanding. "We can't let him back out now. Time is running out." Mark's heart sank. Whatever Eleanor was planning, it was far bigger than he had imagined, and he was right in the middle of it. Mark's blood ran cold. Whatever was happening, he was entangled in something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Sitting alone in the grand library, he tried to make sense of it all. Eleanor's cryptic words, the damning documents, and the diary entries weighed heavily on his mind. The once awe-inspiring estate now felt suffocating. A gilded cage, hiding dark secrets behind its luxurious exterior. That evening, Mark sought out Mr. Harris, the estate's head butler. The older man carried himself with a calm demeanor, but there was a quiet air of knowing about him. "Mr. Harris," Mark began hesitantly, "I need your help. Something isn't right here." The butler regarded him with a steady gaze, his hands clasped behind his back. "I was wondering how long it would take before you came to me, Mr. Davis." Mark leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know something, don't you? About Eleanor, about all of this." Mr. Harris hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "You're not the first young man to be drawn into Eleanor's world," he said finally. "She is clever, resourceful, and ruthless when it comes to her goals. My advice? Watch your back." Mark's chest tightened. "If you know what she's capable of, why are you still here?" The older man's expression softened, tinged with regret. "Some of us don't have the luxury of walking away." Determined to find a way out, Mark began formulating a plan. He reached out to Peter, a trusted friend from law school, under the guise of casual conversation. "Peter," Mark asked during their call, "hypothetically, if someone signed a contract under coercion or false pretenses, could it be voided?" Peter paused. "Hypothetically, yes, but it would depend on the evidence." "Why? Are you in some kind of trouble?" Mark deflected quickly. "No, just a class project I'm working on. Thanks, man." In the days that followed, Mark searched Eleanor's office whenever she was away, desperate to uncover something, anything, that might explain her obsession with his father. One late night, as he rifled through her desk, he found an envelope addressed to his father. The letter inside was venomous, written by Eleanor herself. It accused his father of embezzlement, fraud, and deceit that had led to her family's financial ruin. Her words burned with anger. "You left us with nothing. My husband's heart couldn't take the stress, and now he's gone because of you. I will make sure your family pays for what you've done." Mark's stomach churned. This wasn't just about money. Eleanor's actions were fueled by years of pain and a deep, festering need for revenge. Returning the letter to its hiding spot, Mark resolved to act. He couldn't allow himself to be a pawn in her vendetta. That night, he began mapping out possible escape routes from the estate, but Eleanor's sharp instincts picked up on his unease. The next morning, she confronted him in the breakfast room. Her icy presence cut through the quiet as she approached. "You've been busy, haven't you?" she said, her voice calm but laced with menace. Mark froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about." Eleanor smiled coldly, her piercing gaze locking onto him. "Don't play coy with me, Mark. If you think you can outsmart me, you're sorely mistaken." Her words sent a chill down his spine. She was always one step ahead, and she wasn't going to let him go easily. "I've dealt with far craftier opponents than you," Eleanor said, her voice sharp as a blade. Mark swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I haven't done anything wrong." Eleanor leaned closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "If you betray me, you'll wish you hadn't. Remember that." Straightening, she left the room, her cold presence lingering long after she was gone. Mark was left grappling with a chilling realization. Escaping might be even more dangerous than staying, but staying meant surrendering his life to Eleanor's twisted schemes, a fate he refused to accept. As the air in the estate grew heavy with tension, Mark paced the library, his thoughts racing. The private investigator he had quietly hired had just delivered devastating confirmation. Eleanor's late husband, Harold Brooks, had been swindled by Mark's father in a fraudulent real estate deal. The scheme had left the Brooks family penniless, and Harold's death from a heart attack shortly afterward had cemented Eleanor's bitterness. Eleanor's proposal to marry Mark had been more than just a calculated plan. It was her ultimate act of revenge, designed to make his family suffer, even from beyond the grave. Mark clenched his fists, anger coursing through him. How could she hold him accountable for his father's sins? Yet, as much as he despised Eleanor's actions, he couldn't entirely ignore the pain that had driven her. That evening, Mark met with Peter, his trusted law school friend, in secret. With Peter's help, he compiled all the evidence he had gathered, from Eleanor's office and the investigators' findings. Among the documents, they uncovered proof of Eleanor's involvement in shady business dealings, including falsified reports and questionable partnerships. It was clear she was willing to cross any line to rebuild her empire. "Peter," Mark said, his voice heavy with determination, "this is enough to take her down." Peter nodded cautiously. "It is, but you need to be careful. If she realizes you're onto her, there's no telling what she might do." Mark nodded grimly. "She's already done enough damage. It's time to end this." The next morning, Mark waited in the grand sitting room, the evidence secured in his bag. When Eleanor finally entered, her icy composure was as unyielding as ever. Mark stood to face her. "We need to talk," he said, his tone steady. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her tone clipped. "Is that so? What could possibly be so urgent?" Mark pulled out the documents, his voice firm. "I know everything, about my father, about Harold, about what you've been doing to rebuild your fortune." For the first time, Eleanor's calm exterior faltered. Her eyes flicked to the papers in his hand. "You've been snooping again, haven't you?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Do you even understand what your father did to my family?" Mark stepped closer, his voice rising. "I understand that he wronged you. But what about the people you've hurt along the way? What about me? I didn't do anything to deserve this." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "And my family didn't deserve to lose everything. My husband didn't deserve to die of stress and heartbreak while your father lived comfortably. Don't talk to me about fairness, Mark." Mark's hands trembled as he held up the evidence. "Revenge won't bring him back, Eleanor, and it won't undo what happened. You've spent your life consumed by this, hurting innocent people and ruining lives. When does it end?" For a moment, Eleanor's shoulders sagged, and Mark thought he saw a flicker of regret in her eyes. "You remind me of him, you know," she said softly. "Harold, that same fire, that same stubbornness. I didn't expect to feel anything for you, Mark, but here we are." Mark hesitated, caught off guard by her admission. "If you really feel that way, then stop this. Let it go before it's too late." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of car tires crunching on gravel echoed through the estate. Moments later, uniformed police officers entered the room, followed closely by Peter. "Eleanor Brooks," one officer announced, "we have a warrant for your arrest. You're being charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy." Eleanor's icy composure shattered as the officers moved toward her. She shot Mark a withering look, her voice sharp with betrayal. "You'll regret this, Mark." But Mark stood his ground, unflinching. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally taking back control of his life. Eleanor's reign over him, and her quest for vengeance, had come to an end. Eleanor's face hardened as she glanced from the officers to Mark. "You called them?" Mark met her gaze, his voice steady but firm. "You left me no choice." As the officers led Eleanor away, she turned back to Mark one last time. "You may think you've won, Mark, but revenge isn't so easily undone. Be careful it doesn't consume you too." Mark watched her go, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. He had uncovered the truth and protected himself, but her parting words lingered. Could she be right? Would the shadow of their shared history ever truly fade? The sharp bang of a gavel echoed through the courtroom, marking the end of Eleanor Brooks's trial. From his seat in the back row, Mark watched as the woman who once held his life in her hands faced the consequences of her actions. Despite everything, Mark's testimony had helped reduce her sentence, not out of sympathy, but because he understood the complexity of their shared story. For a brief moment, Eleanor turned in her seat and met Mark's gaze. The cold calculation that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a faint, almost apologetic nod. Days later, Mark was summoned to the estate one last time. The grand house, once so imposing and isolating, now felt hollow and empty. Eleanor had arranged for him to receive the deed to the property. The estate lawyer handed Mark a letter written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. "It was never about the money, Mark. It was about closure. Harold deserved justice, but I lost sight of what truly mattered. You've shown me something I thought I'd forgotten, the capacity to move forward. This estate is no longer a monument to my pain. It can be something more. Use it well." Mark sold the estate, a decision that came easily. Its grandeur had been a gilded cage for both him and Eleanor. The proceeds allowed Mark to pay off his family's debts, finally freeing his mother from the burden of his father's mistakes. With the remaining funds, Mark established a scholarship fund in Harold Brooks' name, a way to honor the man who had unknowingly become a casualty of the feud between their families. Mark's return to law school felt like a fresh start. He was more determined than ever to use his education for good. He began interning at a legal aid center, helping those who, like Eleanor, had been wronged and left without recourse. One crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived for Mark. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Sitting on a park bench near campus, he unfolded the paper and began to read. "Mark, I've had much time to reflect. For years, I believed revenge would heal the wounds Harold's death left behind. But I see now that revenge is its own prison. Your kindness, even in the face of my mistakes, taught me something I never expected. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength. Thank you for being better than the world around you. Thank you for showing me that we can break the cycles we inherit. I hope you find the happiness I never could. Eleanor Starr." Mark stared at the letter for a long time, letting the words sink in. Folding it carefully, he tucked it into his jacket pocket, feeling an odd sense of peace. A year after Eleanor's arrest, Mark stood before a group of scholarship recipients at a small ceremony. Behind him hung a simple plaque, the Harold Brooks Scholarship Fund for Second Chances. Mark spoke with conviction. This fund isn't just about money. It's about creating opportunities for those who might otherwise be forgotten. It's about turning pain into purpose. After the ceremony, Mark sat alone for a moment, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past year. His path had been irrevocably altered, but for the first time, he felt he was moving in the right direction. As Mark walked away from the ceremony, a soft smile crossed his face. He glanced up at the clear sky, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting. Eleanor's letter remained in his pocket, a quiet reminder of the lessons they had both learned about redemption, justice, and the transformative power of forgiveness. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of resilience, redemption, and forgiveness. Mark's story reminds us that, even in the face of betrayal and hardship, the choices we make can lead to healing and new beginnings. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below. Your participation means the world to us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring narratives. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time.